Good afternoon. I'm Bevan Shields and I'm the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. The Herald is a proud supporter of the Sydney Summit and have been for many years. And we're also proud of what the Treasurer quite eloquently described earlier as our role as a public square for debates about Sydney. As an example of that, we spent a lot of last year relentlessly examining the damage the poker machines inflict on our city and our state. And I think some of our work there was some of the best that the Herald's done in a long time. And this year we plan to bring a laser-like focus to the issue of housing and housing affordability, housing density, all big issues that require urgent and bold solutions. It's my pleasure now to introduce the third and final discussion for today, and that is the New South Wales Secretaries panel. The four people here on stage have huge influence over the public service, and they're going to be tackling the slightly awkward but very important topic about how the future of Sydney is placed at the centre of decision-making beyond the political cycle, and how to address that balance between short-term benefit versus long-term gain. Unfortunately, Simon Draper and Elizabeth Mildwater have been unable to attend today, but we are thankful to have Kate Boyd joining the discussion. So please welcome Kate Boyd, the Acting Secretary of the Cabinet Office, Michael Coutts-Trotter, the Secretary of Treasury, Susan Pearce AM, the Secretary of New South Wales Health, and Josh Murray, the Secretary of Transport for New South Wales. Please give them a round of applause. As much as I would absolutely love to moderate this panel discussion, that role will fall to Michael Rose, the Chair of the Committee for Sydney. And Michael, if you don't ask Josh about dogs on trains by the end of the panel, we'll all be very disappointed. So please give them another round of applause.
Well, thanks, Bevan, and hi, everyone. And thanks to the four of you for joining us. We know that you have big day jobs, so we're really grateful that you've made as much time as you have made available to us. The discussion today has really been focused on equity in Sydney. There's been quite a bit of focus, particularly in one of the most recent sessions, on the spatial dimension of equity in Sydney, and I think you were mostly in the room for that discussion. But a lot of it's also been about the generational dimension of equity, how we as a city, as a society, should be thinking about intergenerational equity, what actions we should be taking in relation to intergenerational equity. So what I thought I'd do before I go to questions from the audience is to set that up, is to ask each of you, if you wouldn't mind, just saying a few things about how it is you're thinking about the big issues and big priorities in your areas of responsibility, and what's the intergenerational dimension of that. So Michael, I might start with you and we'll come this way.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for having us. So good treasuries are always concerned about the cost being imposed on future generations by the decisions we're making today, and that really manifests itself in being slightly allergic to very large quantities of debt because somebody else has to pay it off. The New South Wales Treasury, since I think 2006, I think it was the first subnational government in the world to produce an intergenerational report which attempts to go, well, what are the long-term trends? What does that mean in 40 years' time for fundamentally a focus on public finances? But the more we do this, the more rich and broad it becomes. So the next intergenerational report, mark it in your calendar, 2026, is going to have a look at wealth and the distribution of wealth between places, between people, and will really bring a new, I think, and probably for the first time in Australia, that kind of focus to looking forward. We do a heap of work as well with colleagues on the energy transition, absolutely critical, and I think we'll come back to it, education and early childhood education and care, both of which are fundamental to both spatial and intergenerational fairness.
Yep. And we will circle back to education. Susan, can I ask you?
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, and hello to you all. Health systems around the world are under significant pressure. I think that's a theme that won't be new to anyone in the room. And we know that in another 30 years' time, we'll have millions more people living right here in Sydney. And so the question for us as we plan for what the future of our health system looks like is to acknowledge that not a lot of health care takes place outside of the hospital setting. We're very focused on hospitals as a society. There's good reason for that, and as a health secretary and someone who's been in health system my entire working life, I absolutely respect the fact that our community should demand a lot from its health system. But from our perspective, we cannot continue to do what we've always done and expect a different result. And so that's a big challenge for us, how we bring the community along with us, how we use technology, and also across New South Wales Health, 228 hospitals, 400 odd community health centres and mental health services. We employ around 180,000 people across this state. We are a very large employer, and that's also something we need to think about because our workforce is changing, their expectations are changing, and the younger generation is demanding and expecting different things from its employer. So there's lots for us to think about.
Kate, I'm going to ask you to come back to another question. So I'll jump to Josh now and I'll come back to you.
Thank you. I think that there's an assumption in transport that either we are planning for the very short term, like Rozelle Interchange tomorrow morning, or the very long term, say 60 years' time, when flying cars should do away with the requirement for the current infrastructure we have. When actually what I've been really impressed with in my 5 months since returning to the transport portfolio is the amount of work on the integration of services that is currently underway. And I think, like most first world cities, over the last 10 years, we have piled on new mega infrastructure. There has been the decade of free money, and there has been the engineering skills shortage treadmill that meant if we weren't on it, we would miss out. So now the task falls to us to integrate and to choreograph those services. And there is a huge amount of work going on in those areas. The pleasing part about that is it also factors in mobility and equality across this city, and also elements around social value, which are gaining traction in terms of all the discussions that we have across government and that you've heard this morning. We will also implement during this calendar year new formal mechanisms to recognise the efforts of climate change in our major infrastructure delivery and bring on board new elements that will also enable us to look at innovation in that same context, which should enable us to inject more multi-generational aspects into the delivery of those pieces of infrastructure, but also how they then work together. And if I look at the top 5 news stories running in Sydney from this morning, Sydney Summit to look at housing, well done. Bradfield City Centre plans now available. Inquiry to focus on transport accessibility in Sydney's west. E-bike and scooter bans, and a bushfire closing the Pacific Highway. All of those elements have to be looked at by a government and a transport department when considering the impact on this city as we plan for the longer term.
Thanks, Josh. So Kate, same question for you. How are you thinking about it wearing your Cabinet Office hat, but also as the representative here today from the sort of central agency of government, how are you thinking about these intergenerational issues as cross-governmental issues?
I think picking up on some of the comments earlier, that public service has always had intergenerational equity in its heart and mind. I mean, that's a big part of the reason why we all seek to come to the public service, I think. But I think there has been a renewed political imperative for governments to demonstrate that they are thinking long term and that they care about these issues. And the creation of the Cabinet Office is evidence of that. We're a brand new agency created in July 2023, so we're Gen Alpha, I think, but we have a long tradition. And it is really about more than just traditional central government coordination. It's about ensuring that there is strong governance and rigorous advice to government that recognises that all of our systems are deeply interconnected and that siloism will never result in us tackling those longer term challenges. So a key way that we also bring an intergenerational lens to policy is through our foresight team in the Cabinet Office. We have a team that is dedicated to helping the public sector apply a future lens to all of its policy work. And we're nation leading in that sense, and a lot of the work of that team is now used by other governments and, you know, has been acknowledged by the OECD as best practice. So we are helping government understand where all of the different decisions that it needs to make fit within that bigger strategic picture, and helping ensure that all of government is aware of the key strategic priorities of the government of the day and are pulling in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Susan, Jacob Ellis spoke earlier today and he introduced this notion of leading for the future. That what's really required is a mindset change that invites people to lead for the future. How are you in health thinking about that challenge, that kind of leadership challenge, and not just as a provider of health services, but as, you know, one of the most significant employers in the state, as an entity that engages with the universities and other institutions? How do you embed that concept of future leadership into what you're doing?
Look, I won't bore the audience with my personal anecdotes that I've shared with you previously, Michael, but I think it's fair to say that, you know, when I started nursing in 1988, the workforce of today has quite different expectations, as I said at the start. And so one of the aspects for us is to really think about that. Now, when you're on frontline service delivery, working in a health service, it's very hard to introduce things like flexible working or some of those things that have become commonplace in other industries. So that's a real challenge for us. And I think technology comes into that. What is the role of AI? What is the role of tele and virtual health? And for our community, I think we need to be very clear and probably a lot better at explaining this. This is not about replacing people. You'll never take people out of health. It is the heart of our health system. Our people are everything to us. But, you know, one example, when I was I spent the first 10 years of my working life as a nurse working in Broken Hill. And, you know, I would have given anything to have access to some of the specialists that we've got in place now for a place like Broken Hill. So they've got now a link between Broken Hill and Royal Prince Alfred Intensive Care Unit. These are the types of things where we're able to shift and make a change. And so our leaders of tomorrow are going to have a very different set of things to contemplate. The last comment I would make, and I was saying to Kate before we came on here, it's hard not to talk about things in the context of the pandemic. And Kate and I were together through the Cabinet Policy Committee process from day one until the very end of that at the start of the pandemic, which I hate to remind you is 4 years ago now since we were seeing those very first cases. One of the biggest lessons that we learned from the pandemic, there were a few good things to come out of it, believe it or not. One of those was working together better and differently with other government agencies, the private sector, NGOs, and so on. And so there was a very significant learning for us. Michael here is my colleague from the Treasury. The Treasury loves the health system because we spend quite a bit of the state budget, as you know, for good purposes, of course. But, you know, we really learn a lot about working together. Fortress Health, that I live in, had to drop its walls and let other people in. And so from our perspective, the future really is to be found in how we can work together better.
Thank you. Another theme today has been this notion that in order to be effective in relation to intergenerational thinking and planning, things need to be done differently, and in particular, people have to be listened to in a different way, or different kinds of people need to be listened to. So Kirsten Fishburn made that point this morning, Rhonda Atui made it maybe 20 minutes ago, and Minister Jackson announced a new integrated office for youth, which I know that you were all excited to hear for the first time a few minutes ago. But this idea that there does need to be a completely different method of seeking out and listening to opinion about the big issues that are affecting our society, particularly for those who have the long-term interest in those solutions. What's already happening? I might start with you, because I know you have a very serious customer service orientation in your delivery today, but what about for the future? How are you informing yourself about who you'll be serving, how you'll be serving them, and what their needs might be, which are different to those that you're seeing today?
I think the test for us, Michael, is how well do we listen to other organisations and the people within them first. Transport does, of course, listen to its passengers in both a formal and informal manner, although perhaps not in the right balance, because I can tell the audience here today, the feedback we get from our bus passengers probably triples or quadruples the feedback that we get across the rail network. But do they get equal share of voice then when decisions are being made and investment is being applied? So these are learnings that we have to get better at. What I've seen, and interesting you mentioned Kirsten, she and I, our appointments were announced on the same day, and she called me up and she said, we're going to go into this as partners, not in our traditional roles as planning and transport across either sides of the table, arguing that our modelling or our rationale is better. So she and I come together on a monthly basis and we go through the sort of list of things that our departments couldn't get solved on their own, and can we apply a different lens to those? And that's a spirit that I see across the secretaries in analysing where the listening is perhaps not breaking through all of the walls within the large organisations that we lead, and making sure that those priority conversations can come to the fore. But it is a renewed effort that has been there, and it's something that we're learning to share with each other, I think.
So Kate, you mentioned the insights unit. Is it pulling insights from the wider community, or is it pulling sort of academic insights from, the Bureau of Statistics? And
It's mainly focused on academic insights, but a lot of them point to the need for co-governance, I would say. So following on from Josh's comments, I think there's a really strong culture of stewardship amongst the Secretaries Board, that we're not just there as individual leaders of our departments, but as stewards of the system as a whole. And so the practices and culture at that level are certainly well developed, I would say. But it was really interesting to hear Rhonda's comments and also Minister Jackson's around the need for better engagement with community, and that is something we're really focused on. And at the time the Cabinet Office was established, we also now have the Premier's Department, which sits alongside us with a strong community engagement focus, particularly in the Indigenous space, I would say, and the Closing the Gap project in particular, which requires, it is absolutely essential that to meet those targets we are listening and we are co-governing and co-designing with the Aboriginal community.
great. I'm going to go fairly quickly now to some questions from the audience, but just a couple of quick ones first. Michael, for you, as former Education Secretary, the Treasurer today spoke about education as the traditional engine of social mobility and equity in Australian society, and I think, to be fair, he was questioning a little bit whether it still is, or whether there's a risk that it might not be during the lifetime of his children. Can you just share the way you've been thinking about that, first when you had that role as Secretary in the Education Department, and how you look at it now as someone whose ultimate responsibility is to be investing into that system, and just share your thoughts on where you think it's going?
Sure. I feel like an intergenerational secretary. Back in 2007, when I first encountered education and had responsibility for the public system particularly, the first piece of evidence that struck me was that the strongest predictor of a child's educational attainment was the educational attainment of their primary caregiver, usually their mum. In other words, education is a good that is a benefit that is transmitted and amplified over generations, and equally educational deprivation is a disadvantage that is magnified over generations. And so having a school system and allied to it a system of early childhood education and care that understands that and does something to equip families with multi-generational advantage is really, really, really important. And I think that that has become a much greater focus of the community and the government as people are starting to work this out. The link to housing is this, that if you concentrate children from less educationally advantaged households together in communities and in schools, those children will do less well at school than they would if they had access to a school community of greater diversity of educational advantage. It's not to deprecate those schools, they are some of the highest performing schools in New South Wales, but the data in Australia and internationally will show that those same kids dispersed across other school communities will do better. How much better? Well, one study suggested at the age of 15, PISA test, 3 years of schooling difference between two kids with the same educational level of educational advantage at home, one in a school of concentrated educational advantage and one not. So where we give people access to affordable, stable, sustainable housing and how that relates to access to high quality public schools really, really, really matters. So we can save money by concentrating social housing in places where land is cheap and it's cheap to develop, but that has multi-generational cost.
Thanks, Michael. First question from the floor comes from someone called Bevan. It's for you, Josh. Dogs on trains, yes or no?
Well, I would say that it's going to require investment, a health impact and some legal change, so I'd rely on my colleagues to assist. But look, it's definitely something that is being looked at. The question has recurred over recent times. It's a very popular topic, and it is also very split in terms of the discussions that we are having. We are looking at the overseas experience. I know it was detailed just before we came on and I didn't get to hear all of that synopsis. But we know it matters to a lot of people, including those who would be adversely affected, and we also have to take into account the feelings of our staff who are absolutely flat out running a safe and reliable service at the moment. That has to be their top priority, and also enabling access for those who are disadvantaged when it comes to accessing public transport. So we do have to put those priorities first, but I acknowledge that pets on public transport is a big issue and it's not going to go away.
Okay, so that's just honouring the commitment to our media sponsor. I'll move on now. I have a question here from Ed, who is a 30-year-old transport planner. So it's another one for you, Josh, I'm sorry. The question goes to the emissions targets that the state has announced and that transport is responsible for implementing a fair part of it. How are you approaching decarbonisation? And in fact, I can ask that question more broadly. I might ask it of you too, Susan. So we'll start with you, please, Josh.
Thanks, and we have rolled out a number of key targets, interim targets leading up to a 2050 blanket ruling across transport where we would be carbon neutral. And I'm pleased to say we are making really good progress around that. For those who aren't aware, rail travel across the city is now about 99% emissions free. And that just relies on the last little bits of light rail to come across onto green energy sources. So we are moving the dial, and we know that actually in terms of our passengers, more people being aware of that, it is now a choice in terms of buying your travel and where you want to travel and how you want to move across the city. So we need to make more of it. In terms of the provision of major infrastructure, this is the next big step for us. So green fleets, green construction plant, and then carbon reduction in the actual embedded product of our major infrastructure, which is of course largely concrete and steel, has to be this next level. And New South Wales, being the largest transport department in the country, having the largest share of the state's capital work spend, has to be the informed and progressive buyer in the market. We can make enormous change through the transport choices that are put in place and the way we bring those to market. So late last year, we announced our Sustainability in Infrastructure program. We formally recognise carbon reduction targets in our major infrastructure builds, and we also recognise the non-carbon impacts of more integrated transport developments, which you'll see roll out in the transport housing connections as we go forward. So I'm very confident that we can make some big changes. The other element that's been really pleasing is that at a federal level and on our interstate partnership level, other secretaries have said to me, we don't need to reinvent the solutions in our jurisdiction. If you're progressed on this, you are getting the industry behind you, we will cut, copy and paste and get underway with this as well. So I would hope that we'd see that start to really accelerate over the next 12 months.
Okay. Susan, would you like to handle that one as well?
Yes, health systems are huge contributors to carbon emissions. Something like 8 to 9% of carbon emissions come out of the health system. And we contribute to that in many ways. Medical gases is one, so some of the products that are used in anaesthetics, for example, emit incredible amounts of carbon. Waste, and obviously energy in the form of, the power, our fleet, etc. So similar to Josh, we are seeking to have our fleet, run in a climate-friendly way, and that transition is occurring. We're looking at that obviously also for our ambulance service that have got a large fleet on the road on any given day. We're now covering the roofs of our hospitals with solar panels. So if you look at the roof of the John Hunter, for example, which is a big roof, the whole thing is covered in solar panels. So we have got a great opportunity to really contribute to improving that. We were shown recently from some of our waste products that the team are now making tiles from them, so repurposing the waste into actually being able to use things. But the really other interesting aspect of this work around the climate is to invigorate our staff around hopefulness for the future. And we had a chap from the NHS come and talk to us who's a young guy. He's a doctor. He actually comes from Australia, but he's been working in the NHS. And they are actually well advanced. New South Wales is a much better health system, of course, and it genuinely is on every measure. You can Google it and find out. But on climate change and the efforts around that, the NHS is way out in front. And one of the interesting things that they observed about that was to give their staff hope for the future and to lift them up a little bit. It's fair to say, we've all had, back to COVID, had a pretty rough time over these last 4 years between bushfires, floods, COVID, and everything in between. We want to give our staff something to grasp onto for the future, and we have been giving small grants to our staff to come up with ideas about how they can better improve what we're doing in that space. And the last comment I'll make is that, interestingly, Ed, I think who asked that question is 30. I think the interesting aspect of this from my perspective, again, I've got a 31-year-old son. It's our kids who are really putting pressure on their parents, who are in positions where you can make this change to really get out and do that. And I think that generation is pushing that along, in some cases, through their parents.
Okay. There's a couple of questions here which are picking up on the notion it's all well and good to consult the community more and in different ways, but you have to convert that into action. And then there's also a set of questions which are saying, and in addition to community consultation, there's a real need for collaborative action with industry and with other significant stakeholders, and there's some of those are directed directly at the housing sector. How can government collaborate more closely with the community housing sector and also the commercial housing sector? And a couple here that are just talking about collaboration with industry more broadly. Michael, I'll address this to you, but invite the others to jump in. From government side, do you feel there are inhibitors when it comes to collaboration with the private sector? And what could we be thinking about changing, or what could we be focusing on to try and improve the nature of collaboration between the private sector and government in responding to these long-term issues?
Yeah, good question, difficult to answer. I think, firstly, time. Collaboration takes time in investing in relationships and shared understanding, and time's at a premium. Secondly, the decision-making processes of government do from time to time demand a degree of confidentiality, and I know this is heavily contested, but there are some very real constraints that attach to that. But I do think that we collectively need to be prepared to take a few more risks on looking a bit silly, having half-baked ideas out there before they're fully baked, because the opportunity lost by being too insular is really, really significant. I mean, I think we saw it through COVID. Credit to the way many of my colleagues worked in an environment where things were deeply uncertain and constantly changing. A lot of things didn't work well, but a lot of things worked brilliantly as a result of trusting collaboration. Last point, what matters profoundly is the kind of people who come and work in the public sector and how they think and feel about their roles as public servants. And I am amazed by the diversity of the people who work in Treasury, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of perspective, diversity of age, and increasingly including First Nations colleagues. And that makes for a much better listening organisation. One, because the slightly stale leadership of the place is shaped and driven and challenged by colleagues. And secondly, and obviously, people bring perspectives to the work that are, genuinely fresh.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in there?
I would just reiterate that I think everyone within government appreciates the importance of that, particularly because the government has set such ambitious targets in its key priority areas. So housing and net zero would be the two that are the most acute. And I think everybody realises we're not going to get there on our own, even if all the levers of the state government are pulled and we are all, doing everything within our power to do it. Without collaboration and buy-in from the private sector, from community housing providers, from the communities in the regions that may be impacted by land use and changes in terms of forestry and to achieve those net zero ambitions. I think we're all acutely aware of it, and I think part of the skill set of a modern public servant is the relationships and the focus on that. And I have that in my mind, Susan, the day that the government decided to lock down southwest Sydney. I think we were on a Teams call with 600 people from various private sector and community organisations, councils. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't, pre-planned, but it got the job done, and we had invaluable feedback from the sector on the impact of this and how we could ameliorate some of that. And it was, it's just, I remember that often in terms of how to, the importance of the community in policy design and in dealing with these issues and inspiring sort of intergenerational thinking in government.
Another really important collaborator that Kirsten mentioned this morning is, of course, local government, and she was making the point about just how much of the ability to be successful, particularly in the planning space, but in most areas, relies on the effective relationship between state and local governments and the resourcing of local governments. Is that where it needs to be? I'll start with you there, Kate. And
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, especially in housing, the focus is on the traditional demand side levers of the state government. So, good policy and planning on the planning side, an efficient functioning planning system, the state's role as a social and affordable housing provider, as a rental regulator. Those are the traditional levers. But I think we do need to start looking a little bit more on the demand side and whether or not we have the right incentives for councils to perform in that system, because they are a key part of completions. We will not get there if local councils aren't all performing at their peak on that front. So I do think there is an appetite and a need for government to look more broadly at all of the levers, demand and supply, where spaces state government hasn't traditionally focused on to achieve those outcomes.
Sorry, go ahead,
Yeah,
Josh.
I might add to that, Michael. I think where we're going to see real change, if we look at the conference's aims of intergenerational interventions and the experience of Sydney communities, it's by government being agile enough to get in and do those grassroots changes. And to do that, partnership with local councils will be required. If we think about the transport context, the idea in the past was that people would want to get up in the morning, get into public transport or into their car and go to the city for their work. Then perhaps we moved into a zone where we said, well, people might want to go to a big business park where there's other like-minded businesses, and that will form their daily commute. And actually what we know, and actually informed by things like COVID, is the real impact intergenerationally is if we make community-minded solutions come to life, and we can spread that around the city and the state where it works for those local communities, that people can travel from their home to a destination and it's linked and the services are integrated and they make sense and they're enjoyable and they're safe and they enable their kids to travel. All of those things are going to have much bigger intergenerational impacts for the user than sweeping statewide policy impacts. So we have to get that balance right. And to your question, I think local councils are the ones who are feeding us a lot of that information at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I remember you spoke at our Blacktown Summit, and I remember just how your emphasis there on the work with Blacktown City Council about getting some of the great results that have been achieved out there.
I think the vibrancy aims of the government, which impact all of us in terms of bringing those elements to life, are making big changes in local communities for not a lot of investment. But they are things that people are really taking to heart, taking to their homes, and they're changing their travel patterns for us in transport as a result. So it's benefiting people, it's benefiting businesses, and that gives that local vitality.
I'm just keeping my eye on the clock, and at the committee we like to be a do tank as well as a think tank. So we need from each of you, please, a bit of a call to action. Thinking about what your roles are, thinking about what the intergenerational complexities are in the roles that you're performing, what is it you would like the committee and its members to be thinking about or working on? I know you know that we have long lists for each of you, but if you've got a great room of highly interested and motivated people here, what are the things that you would really want them to sort of take to heart and start thinking about in their own organisations to help you in your task, or to move the dial in Sydney intergenerationally? No pressure in that question, so whoever wants to go first can have it. I'm going to choose you, Michael, then we'll just come down the line.
Okay. So very, very generally, so John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, things don't happen, things are made to happen. And that is really just a call for all of us to do what we can with what we've got in the roles that we have now. You wouldn't be sitting in the room if you weren't already doing that. But I would encourage you to keep doing it, and particularly for young people, I'd encourage you to keep doing it without cynicism. Sometimes you can experience a very, very long period where not much seems to change, and then suddenly things change positively and remarkably quickly. I would encourage people to think about spending some time working in the public sector. It's no longer a job for life, it's a job for a while, and I would encourage my public sector colleagues to think about spending some time working outside the public sector.
That was going to be mine, Michael.
Well,
Sorry.
Come and work for us. That's what
you've got a minute and a half to think, Kate. Keep going. Susan.
Three things. One is in relation to a comment I made at the start, that we need to start thinking about health, and I don't mean to generalise this for the whole group. It's not about bricks and mortar and the four walls of a hospital. We've got an opportunity to really think about health in a different way as we continue to see those demands on the health system. The second thing is that we know from the evidence that the first 2,000 days of a child's life are very instructive about what follows in the course of their life, whether it's incarceration, heart disease, or other factors that really influence people's lives. I mean, it obviously tangles up in the education discussion, but the first 2,000 days of a child's life are critical, and as a government, government agencies, we are working together squarely at looking what those first 2,000 days look like for our kids. And the last thing I will say is that for Aboriginal people, and this is something that we are very focused on in the health system, as a society, we can and must do better. We talk about closing the gap, but it will not close until we truly understand what happened to Aboriginal people during our own lifetime, something that many of us, including myself, were, as a kid growing up, not educated about, and something that we're working really hard on in the health system to address.
Thank you. Kate.
Well, in addition to my recruitment pitch, I was just going to emphasise the need, if there is a feeling that government can do better in terms of engagement, any ideas as to how we can do that better, new forums, new ways of working to help, because there are so many times where government is trying to understand the root cause of a delay or an issue that might be stalling a key priority, and the best source of that information is the community and the private sector, and so that those engagement forums are critical. And I would say for the committee, for all of you here today, participate in them when you see them. If you have new suggestions and ideas for how we can do that better, we're open to them, because the focus of your questions have been quite government-centric, but these are shared challenges and shared responsibilities.
Yeah. Josh.
I'll add my voice to the recruitment pitch. I came back to government after 15 years, and it is inspiring to work on elements like this, but as Susan spoke to as well, the bigger picture issues confronting our communities. In terms of a call to action, I guess I just reflect on the fact that in Sydney, we absolutely demand better from transport. It's one of our top 5 skills. It's a hobby that we have. We want more, we want better, and our people, our citizens deserve it. I just ask that we also remember the people who pull it together every day on the front line, as they do in each of our departments. But if I give one anecdote, which was on New Year's Eve, we moved the entire daily commute of Sydney basically to one location, the harbour side, and we took them home, almost 1 million people, within 90 minutes of the end of the fireworks at midnight, safely, reliably, and due to the fact that people in high-vis and grey and orange shirts stayed up all night and moved those people. And I just asked, as a call to action, let's, as business and community leaders and advocates, think about the people who put together our public services, because they do an amazing job, and it helps us do our job as well and tackle these issues that you've put on the table today.
Oh, hear, hear. Okay, there are so many questions here, and I'm going to apologise to those people who asked questions and I didn't then ask them. But what we are going to do, we've been collecting them all throughout the day, and we're very fortunate at the committee that the secretaries and their colleagues give us a lot of their time, and there will be other opportunities for us to have the discussions raised by these questions with them in the future. So your questions are not lost, and they will be raised. But right now, we have to release these people to the joys and sorrows of their day jobs. So please join me in thanking them for being here with us today. Thank you very much.